everybody. Welcome to Out Comes the Sun podcast with my partner, Melissa Yamaguchi. We are excited today because we have a really amazing guest that I met kind of through her father. And she is doing work that both Melissa and I are just super in tune with, right? So her name is Sofia Webb. And she is a if I get any of this wrong, Sophia, you can totally correct me. But she is a
absolutely.
She is a psychotherapist, and I'm going to ask some questions about that because I kind of don't know the difference between a psychotherapist and a psychologist and things like that. So, but she's
absolutely.
a psychotherapist dealing with, what I love is that she's dealing with trauma as it affects our mental health, our mental balance. So, and the other thing that I really love about her is that, her happy, peaceful, mindful place comes from nature. And of course, you'll sing my song. So Sophia, welcome to the podcast. We're so excited to be able to have a conversation with you because you're just in tune with everything we're trying to put together, except you're an expert, and that makes it legit. Look at my background, my bed isn't cut. Well, that's an interesting.
Anyway, thank you for having me. I just am so in tune with what you're prioritizing here, which is to build accessibility and awareness of mental health. And I think trauma is something that we're not fully aware of, and how it can present. And the way we think of trauma is the very extreme version, right, that we see in movies, or maybe what has been normalized for us, but there's so much more behind it.
Absolutely.
And I think it helps to know how our current behaviors are linked to that trauma, whether it's complex trauma or relational trauma or different things you've experienced multiple times throughout your life and childhood that are now, presenting in your adult relationships, and different interactions. So
would you even say that there is trauma coming from this whole world of social media? Do you think that's traumatizing young people?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's, basically flaring up perfectionism, right? Which is also a result of being highly criticized by your parents or, in other avenues, or being bullied as a child. And so now social media has just continued that through adolescence, through adulthood. It's putting unrealistic standards on our daily existence. And so I definitely think it's just this ongoing trauma that's at a large scale. But I also think we can practice media literacy and use it as a healthy tool if we understand, right, how it can be toxic to us. So obviously this is a way, right, that you can also connect and share information. So that's kind of how I work with adolescents to have a healthier approach to social media instead of, not using it in the best way.
Well, I think that we forget as a different generation, and even though you're still very young, but you're not that young, that you had some time without this kind of technology that is so overwhelming. I mean, kids nowadays are brought up with a technology that we never had that, proclivity to. And I think that we forget that they need education as to what it was like without that. And so, I was just at the gym, and Bobby, my partner, and I were working out, and there was a kid, and Bobby looked over at him, and he was on his phone, and he goes, "I'm so sorry." And the kid looked at him and he said, "I'm so sorry we did this to you," right? Yeah, I'm so, meaning, we gave you all this technology, and he said, "You're so disconnected." What was interesting is he said, "No, my mother's been very diligent about, she turns my phone off, whether I like it or not, 2 times a day. It's just turned off and I can't use it." And I thought that was a really interesting, I mean, sometimes you have to kind of do these boundaries or something. I don't know. But I mean, for you, it's let's educate the youth of what it, it's okay. It can be this great tool, wonderful tool, but you have to understand that what you're looking at isn't always the truth, and whatever, you know what I'm saying. And I applaud you for your work. And so how, kind of explain to us, how would you go about let's say a teen comes to you with issues, doesn't even know what those issues are. How do you find or help them find what that trauma is? Maybe explain a little bit. I mean, I'm sure it's super complicated, but explain maybe that journey, a little bit of that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So with trauma, we use very much a bottom-up approach because a lot of times we're tuned out, right? We are feeling very unsafe in our bodies and we're not sure why. And so we first build that awareness of what this feels like. How is it showing up in my body?
Right.
How do I build stability in that? How do I respond to my emotions in a healthy way before we even move on to processing kind of the memories and thoughts related to some of the trauma. So that's how I would start off, is first building that awareness of what is my trauma. And a lot of times I have teens or adults come in who don't realize that what they experienced was trauma.
Right.
And it happens all the time. And so we first have to build that awareness and that stability before we can even go into that place of like deeper memories or maybe things that aren't being brought up. And then we kind of think about integrating the trauma. So how can I build strengths from this? And I like to think of it as post-traumatic growth, which is that this is the power that I have in my trauma. I didn't choose, right? My favorite quote by Michelle Rosenthal is, I didn't choose my trauma, but I do choose healing. And how can I make this part of my story and own it? So that's really how I start off, and kind of just to show you the different stages of trauma healing and recovery. But a lot of times it's first just building awareness, like body awareness and understanding of triggers, and then how to respond to them in a healthy way.
Right. That's interesting. I mean, kind of my uneducated kind of perspective on it is, I've always said that I think the first kind of step into recovery and healing is to tell your story. Because once you tell your story, it becomes a story. And then once it's a story, it no longer has this incredible power over you, because it becomes something that you can go, oh, wow, I told the story. It didn't hurt me. I'm still alive. I'm not traumatized. And actually, for my own personal self and my own healing throughout the years, the more I tell my story, the more healing and the more distant it becomes, the more of a memory. It's like watching a movie now. It's like, I think that was a part of my life. But I think it's so important to break it down. It's your story. You're honored for it. You hold space for that person to express themselves and let it out. And then it's like, now we get to nurture the inner child, so to speak, that never got that healing, right? Was trying to protect you. Is that correct?
Yep, absolutely.
By the way?
Absolutely. No, self-compassion is a huge skill that I focus on when I'm working with individuals, kind of processing some of that trauma and healthier ways to respond to it, because there's such deep shame that we hold. There's also self-blame, right?
Yes.
Because when we experience those things as children, we just have our emotions. We don't have the logical part of our brain developed. So the way we handle this information is to blame ourselves and internalize it. And so we have this deep shame we carry into adulthood, and owning your story is such a great example of self-compassion. And then that leads to common humanity, right? Now I'm connecting to others, seeing I'm not alone. Now I'm coming out of isolation. And so it's this beautiful process that I love to see people go through, realizing, first starting in that therapeutic space, like your story is valid and it's safe to talk about it, and then see them start to bring that to people close to them and to family, and they're just kind of blossoming and owning their story. So I think it's such a beautiful thing. And I don't know if you have heard of Brene Brown, but she talks so much about, embracing imperfection and owning your story, and working through the shame that you have for it. So
yeah. Oh, she's wonderful. I actually had the pleasure of being interviewed by her, strangely enough, in Texas.
That's amazing.
Once, and it was so cool. And I was just so, asked, why are you talking? Because she's like, you're Brene Brown.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was, she is awesome. And she does
Yes.
have such an amazing way of that compassion place, that self-compassion place is so powerful, but it's not easy to get to, right? It's hard for people. Cause I think, and also I know for Melissa and I's generation, there was a lot of like, put everybody in front of you, you know, take care of your kids, take care of this person, that person, you know, like that self-care felt very I mean, for many years, I couldn't do it because I thought, oh, that makes me a bad person. Like I didn't realize that, you know, take the oxygen first before you give it to your child. But it just seems so like awkward. Like how could you do that? It must be a bad mother then, or whatever. So it's interesting, and it is an interesting journey. But it's such a promising one, right? It's so
absolutely.
It has such deep healing. Melissa, I'm just talking away. Please, just help me.
I have two questions. I have two questions, and I can't weave the two of them together easily, so I'll have to bookend them, and we can jump through it. My first question really is, I'll wait till Mariel's finished moving her dresser. The first question I have is, as a parent, as a caregiver, as someone who has the child in your home, or if someone who's taken in someone through foster care or whatever, grandparent, extension of original place where perhaps trauma may have occurred, what are some warning signs that an adult who maybe is from a different generation or may just be oblivious innocently to things they need to look for in their child, preteen, teen, whatever age they are? What's something we should look for?
Yeah, I think you start seeing some of those, trauma responses, whether it's fight or flight, or, fawn or freeze. And so it can look like shutting down, being disconnected, kind of isolating. It can also look like a little bit of lashing out or, kind of this physical burst of emotion because, depending on the age, right, this is a lot of emotions and I don't have some of those reasoning skills or rational thinking to work through these emotions. And if I don't have an adult modeling that for me, right, a lot of times children don't have healthy modeling by the adults in their lives on how to process emotions. And we're just always kind of going into this trauma response that can look like fight or flight or fawn or freeze. So freeze is more shutting down and fawning looks like I keep myself safe by kind of taking care of everyone else's needs and making sure everyone else is okay. So I think if you're noticing those changes or you're noticing kind of this pulling away and isolating or lashing out or kind of just shutting down and being quiet and not really being engaged, that's probably a sign of concern. And it's better to check in and be direct. I think a lot of times we teeter-totter around it, or even with, suicidality, that we're kind of scared to ask those direct questions. But it's, in any training I've done on kind of working with crisis or suicidality, it's good to ask direct questions and check in.
Yes.
And I think a lot of times we are scared to do that, but that could be, that point into the conversation, into that vulnerable conversation to say, I do need help right now.
Yes. It's interesting. I'm listening to you talk about the symptoms to look for, and they don't sound too different, excuse me, than what we hear parents guided to look out for in the event that their child is entertaining addictive behavior, getting involved in drugs or something. So it sounds like a lot of the flags, errant behavior, out of the norm, whatever, withdrawing or lashing out, are just these are flags, and it's the spirit calling for help when the mind and body can't, right? So I have my second question for you is, what are the biggest challenge that I see in people that we speak with and we hear from is that they struggle with their coping skills, even if they've identified the trauma, they've identified the addiction, whatever the it is, they've identified it, they've written it into their story and their speech, but it's their coping skills on how to address it that seems to be the biggest backslide. So can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, those coping skills that are developed, even if they're maladaptive or they're unhealthy, are what makes us feel safe, right? They are protective parts that we have developed, and we're not broken. Like, they have served a fundamental need for us. And so it's hard to let go of those things, right? Because that's all we know. It's what's familiar. It's how we've learned how to deal with, the intense feelings and emotions we're getting in our body and the results of the trauma. And so a trauma-informed approach is to recognize that and hold space for that while we're moving towards a healthier way of coping. And I think also building awareness and validating that, those protective parts. And I love internal family systems because there are no bad parts. And so we are able to unblend those different parts of us, trust the self more, which has always been there, and be able to hold space for excelled parts. So I encourage, people to seek psychotherapy and someone who is trauma informed, because they're going to know some of those different interventions that hold space for those unhealthy coping mechanisms while moving towards a healthier space. Because again, we're thankful for the way they kept us safe, but they're no longer serving us.
Totally.
And so we need to kind of grow and expand into something that's going to serve us better.
Yeah, that's powerful, because it is those things that you think. It's also like, you think, if I let go of this, like, what will I know that in the past, when I was getting through stuff or healing certain parts of my imbalance or whatever, I would think to myself, what happens if I don't have this? Like, what will I focus on? Like, sometimes we have to address the desire to stay in a state of kind of chaos or discomfort, because you don't know what it's like to not be in that. And like, the only coping mechanism is to stay there, right? Because that's what you know. So it's interesting when you start to trust that there's something better on the other side. I mean, I spent so many years being depressed that it wasn't until I wasn't depressed that I realized I'd been depressed most of my childhood and young adult life. And it was just this realization. I was like, oh, wait. I was so accustomed to that feeling, like it was a low-grade fever, that I just, it was trauma, and it just kept building. It was like building this block. But it wasn't a real block, right? It wasn't a solid foundation. It was kind of flimsy. But it's interesting, because when you acknowledge it, then you do have the opportunity to make a shift into your healthy, mental choices, being able to make choices. I think that that's what's key about healing, is knowing that you have choice, right? To some degree.
Yep.
Whereas you didn't think you had any choices. I don't know.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember too that we're very disconnected and we can be very dissociated because of our trauma. And so we first need to be able to build safety and being present and being able to be mindful and have awareness of the unhealthy coping mechanism. So that's why we go through this process of a bottom up approach, rather than maybe the more typical approach of top down that we see, with other mental health needs. And so we're focusing on that first, then we can kind of move into that space. So that we can be present and build awareness.
Well, it kind of,
that oftentimes is a barrier.
Yeah, it kind of feels like holistic functional medicine versus the sort of like, let's treat the symptom, right? When you're treating the symptom, you don't know what like, how do you actually heal if you don't know what the core problem is, right? So it's like you're starting deep and then coming out to the outer end of whatever the issues are. And it makes so much more sense.
Absolutely. Well, that's another issue too with treatment of trauma, is that, we kind of focus on PTSD. That's, if you look at the DSM-5, we don't really have an expansive diagnoses to kind of think about complex trauma or developmental trauma, and that's an issue too in the field and treating trauma. And I think we need to expand our understanding of it. So, there's just a lot of issues with that prescriptive approach and the medical framework. And then you have misdiagnoses, right? Because we aren't, seeing this as developmental or complex trauma, then we're kind of just thinking, okay, we're looking at the symptoms. We're not thinking of the past trauma. Maybe it's ADHD or something else. And then we're totally missing a huge part of the picture and not really healing the trauma, right? We're neglecting that part, just focusing on the present symptoms. And I think that can cause a lot of harm. And, it has personally for me in my life, I experienced trauma growing up and I got an ADHD diagnosis. And there are a lot of individuals who have that, right? But for me, it missed the mark. And I was treating kind of, the distraction, not able to concentrate, not being able to be present, fidgeting, that kind of thing, where a lot of it could have been connected to the symptoms of trauma.
Right.
And so I think it's important that we have a more expansive approach to treating trauma so that that's not happening.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to take a tiny little break. And what I want to say is you can get to Sofia. You can actually have a consultation with her if you wanted to. On Instagram, it is, okay, help me again, at mindful.indigo, right? And
Perfect.
then mindfulindigo.com is her site. Amazing. And go there, get a consultation. I mean, truly, your work is making a difference. And what I love is that it's not this kind of like put Band-Aids on. And anyway, so we'll take a slight break. Sorry. Breaking.
I want to thank one of our incredible sponsors, BrainTap. You may have listened to our podcast with the founder of BrainTap, Patrick Porter. And if you did, you'll definitely want to get involved in BrainTap. And if you didn't, please, I strongly recommend that you go back and listen. It's so incredibly informative. Here's what BrainTap can do. You can literally build your brain fitness with BrainTap's mobile app and wearable headset. Everyone here at Outcomes the Sun podcast has had and continues to have positive results with BrainTap. Your brain is guided from awake and reactionary patterns to intuitive and creative responses. BrainTap is backed by neuroscience and research and was developed by Patrick Porter himself. BrainTap creates a symphony of brainwave activity to optimize your brain's potential, restore your ability, balance your energy, and calm your brain. And listen, it is a game changer when it comes to sleep. This technology is truly a gift, and I am so incredibly grateful to be able to share it with you.
If you're just joining us, we are speaking to Sofia Webb, who is a psychotherapist dealing specifically with trauma. Very well, I don't know. She's incredibly good at helping draw out that story that is inside of us. We've been talking about that. I want to ask you about post-traumatic healing. Is that what it's called? Or post-traumatic growth? Explain what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a concept in positive psychology that shifts the focus from only the experience of the trauma, but also, thinking about the growth that can happen after a traumatic experience. And we kind of go through this shattering experience. There's a term for it called positive disintegration, where basically all these pieces of us are on the ground. And we can choose to pick up the pieces that are going to serve us and help us heal and move forward, and leave behind the parts that are not helping us move forward. And so this is a part of developing who we are and coming closer to our authentic self. I like to call it like breaking through the calcification of trauma. And so it's just a different perspective. We're shifting our perspective to see the empowerment of choosing healing from that experience. And I think if you look into nature, you see this happen. Forest health, right? Wildfires happen. It clears old brush so that new growth can happen. And so it's this process of rebirth over and over and over again to create space for growing. And so essentially we go through this traumatic experience, but we also have tremendous growth, and we develop strengths, and we get to know ourselves better. We're closer to who we truly are by learning healthier ways to cope, by building self-awareness, by reaching out for supports and building a community. So I think it kind of forces us to break from those old habits.
And also not being afraid of the trauma, right? Not be actually embracing it as part of your growth, right? Am I correct in that? Because I mean, I think that we all kind of, we can all look back on some of our past experiences, whether they be, you know, quote unquote negative or positive, but sometimes those negative things is like, wow, if I hadn't gone through that, I probably wouldn't know what I know today. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be having conversations with amazing people like you and doing this podcast if I hadn't had the trauma that came. But you know what I mean? At some level, that becomes the thing that makes you who you are, but you can be the best version of yourself once you understand that trauma doesn't own you anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, it's important to recognize too that it doesn't minimize or invalidate, you know, the pain of the trauma and the hurt and all the negative emotions of it. But what we're doing is we're learning to hold space for that and, you know, for our positive feelings and emotions and our power in choosing the healing and growth and the strengths that can come from it. And I think it's important that we can be a whole person in that way. We can hold space for our painful experiences, own the negative, you know, dark side of our story while we're stepping into the light and learning how to create space for that, feel safe in our light. I think a lot of times when you've experienced trauma over and over and over again, you build a lot of safety in the chaos, you know, and we don't feel safe to step into our light or into a safer space, a healthier space. So it's kind of like this idea of finding balance. And becoming whole.
Oh, it's so good.
You know, what a painful position to be in for someone who's undergone trauma, because that chaotic, painful code of familiarity becomes one they put on simply because it is familiar, right? And they don't want it, and they know it doesn't fit right. It's missing buttons. There's a lot of things they don't like about the coat anymore, but they keep putting it on, and it's almost. It's fascinating. I was listening to you say it and I was thinking, we've met a ton of people. I know people personally who continue to fall back into the drama and the chaos, not realizing they have a voice and a choice. And so I love what you're doing. And you said something earlier that I locked into. You said positive psychology, which I thought was so brilliant. I took some psychology, albeit not nearly. I mean, a sneeze compared to what you know. In college when I was a wee lass, and I was my first experiences were not always about positivity. It was, you know, kind of the fixating on the negative. And so I love this concept of positive psychology and really embracing that.
Yeah, absolutely. A thought that came to me as you were both talking is, so, you know, thinking about how humans, we seek out what's familiar, right? Even if it's dysfunctional, which kind of keeps us in that space. And I think too, this makes me think of children and how I don't know if you've heard that saying, right? But kids are so resilient. And in a sense, it's minimizing their experience, the way they're impacted by trauma. What they're doing is they're adapting because they have no choice but to adapt. And so they build safety in the chaos because they have no choice but to do that. So it's not resilience. Resilience is being able to sit with your emotions, understand them, process them, respond to them in a healthy way.
It's just like fight or flight, right? It's like survival.
Yeah. Yeah. So they're adapting to their environment, and their nervous system is adapting to it. And so now, in the most fragile points of their development. And so now as adults, they're wondering, why am I drawn to this? Why do I gravitate towards this chaotic relationship or environment? Well, it feels safe. Your body learned to feel safe in that because it had no choice. So kids are not resilient, right? They adapt.
Right. That's an important point. That's really important.
It really is. That's a powerful, powerful thing. Thank you for that. I don't think we've ever heard that before. That's really interesting because it's such a thing.
So I promise
kids are resilient, you know, that, and it is so, and it does minimize their experience. Because if I think about, my own childhood and stuff like that. It's nice. It gives you kind of like, oh, okay, that was as tough as I thought it was. It's just.
Well, I think we throw it on kids to make it easy on
I
ourselves.
think so too. I think it gives us
she's
an
resilient.
excuse
She's
to
got
go,
this.
okay, well, they'll make it. Right?
Yeah.
Well, I promise to not use it on children ever again. It will reserve resilient only for my pants after Thanksgiving, so I won't be using it.
Exactly. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation, Sophia. Really, we're super excited. We're going to take another little break, and then we're going to come back and try to wrap it up. Welcome back. We are talking to Sofia Webb. We've had a wonderful conversation really about her work in trauma, psychotherapy and trauma, and post-trauma healing, and amazing stuff. Right. Really, we've touched on things that I think are really important for our audience, because they've probably been with us since the beginning, listening to kind of the different things that we address, but to know from a clinical perspective that kind of what we've been, what Melissa and I have focused on with telling the story and getting in touch with nature and doing like real life things that are tangible in order to unlock the trauma so that you can become a balanced human being. But it's a process. And Sophia, you're incredible. We're so excited that you shared your incredible knowledge with us. If you want to check out Sophia on Instagram, you can go to at mindful.indigo, and then it's mindfulindigo.com. It's Sofia Webb. She is a psychotherapist. She can give you a free consultation. It says so here on her site. And I'm looking for, I've already signed up. And you can, it's just like, this is amazing work. It's important work, and it's actionable work, and it's work that's making a difference. So we're so grateful to have you. Thank you so very much. And please come back and talk to us, because we need to be guided, kind of. So I do personally.
Yeah.
and I
Absolutely.
Well, everything falling to the ground. Like you fall apart and you're all in the pieces, and you can choose to pick up the pieces that serve you, and you can leave the rest. So with that thought, I leave you. I leave you all. Thank you so much for joining us on Out Comes the Sun podcast. We'll talk to you next week. We'll share something fabulous with you next week. Thank you, Sophia, so much. Sophia Webb. Thank you so much. Thank you, Melissa. And thank you, Slater, who's in the background making this all work. Thank you so much for joining us today on Out Comes the Sun. You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, on Apple, and on YouTube. And you can donate to the Mariel Hemingway Foundation at theMarielHemingwayFoundation.org. And I want to spell Hemingway for you, HEMINGWAY.org. I only say that because a lot of people put 2 M's, and that just won't work. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, you can go to the donate button at the bottom, and it will take you right to a link with the QR code. And if you go to marielhemingway.org, you can also press the donate button and be able to donate to the foundation, which is designed to help guide people towards finding the right solutions for their mental health issues. That is my goal. I'm just trying to raise money so I can come up with an app and a website that has all the information you could possibly want to know about mental health and where to go. But we are in the process of making that happen, and your donation means so much to us. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.